So it's not only that it's, happening at the level of high geopolitics in the context of national security or economic growth, it's also happening in the enterprise. And then finally, this layer of how this technology is being democratized and becoming accessible to billions of citizens around the world as well. A good kind of comparison is the internet itself.
You're listening to the ISF podcast for your organization's better cybersecurity. Your host, ISF CEO Steve Durbin, is an expert in leadership, business culture transformation, and cyber strategies for today's top enterprises. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. This week, we bring you a fascinating conversation between Steve and generative AI expert Nina Schick. Nina and Steve discuss how AI, along with other technological trends evolving at exponential speed, are shaping both geopolitics and individual lives.
So Nina, thanks very much for joining me in the studio today. It's great to see you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, you were among the first to identify that AI, particularly generative AI, would present a tipping point for humanity. And you've been quoted as saying, this isn't a story about technology, this is a story about humanity. Tell us a bit more about that. What did you mean?
So I long had a career in geopolitics because I was always interested in kind of macro trends for society and humanity. Ultimately, it comes down to politics and power. And as I was working my geopolitical career on various things like information warfare, election interference, election campaigns, I started realizing that pretty much one of the biggest dominant stories in the 2010s and since onward has been exponential technology. Right. And how these exponential tech trends are not only shaping geopolitics at the highest level, but also shaping the experience of billions of individuals around the world, and faster than anything we've known before. So it was within that context that I first started encountering these new capabilities of artificial intelligence that are now known as generative AI. At the time, it hadn't been coined yet. And the thing that was so astonishing about these new capabilities was AI's ability to move beyond kind of traditional, which was labeling and categorizing data, to actually generating or creating something new. Right. So a form of intelligence, really, which can be planted or integrated into almost any human intelligent or creative activity. This was unlike technology we've ever seen before. And because I think that its rate of acceleration, both in terms of capability as well as adoption, will be one of the fastest trends we've seen before when it comes to technologies. I think this is dramatically going to reshape the geopolitical landscape, but also, again, the experience of billions of people around the world.
Tell us a little bit more about this reshaping of the geopolitical landscape, because that's a slightly new twist from what perhaps a lot of people have heard up until now. Well, what exactly are you sort of envisioning when it comes to that?
I think that when you think about these exponential technologies, in our naivete, perhaps 30 years ago, when the technologies of the modern age, the so-called information age, the internet, smartphone, cloud, when they started emerging, perhaps we didn't understand at that point in the 90s when we were told to prepare for the internet how seismic this would be. Again, for the experience of billions of people around the world, but also what it meant for the power dynamics of the world. Right. And I really experienced that in the 2010s when I was working on election interference and information integrity, seeing kind of how in the context of war, this was playing out in the information ecosystem, and really kind of had like this, like I said, ultimately very interesting geopolitical twist to it. And I think that is now playing out with artificial intelligence as well. But the difference is that it is understood amongst nation states how important it is going to be to have competence in artificial intelligence. So you see how in the United States, so one of the biggest stories when it comes to geopolitics of this century is obviously China versus the US, right? The growing dominance of China and what this means for a world which is, a unipolar world led by the United States. And you see this with investment in artificial intelligence. I mean, the US is way outstripping China, but China is very, very quickly catching up. So you have on one side what's happening between between China and the US, but it's happening all around the world, actually. So Europe tends to underinvest, which is, again, another trend we've been seeing over time. Is Europe going to remain competitive? Is Europe going to remain high-tech enough? Are Europe's competencies going to be able to compete with the likes of China and the US? And Britain has been a big vocal advocate of, okay, we need to kind of harness this technology and learn how to deploy it safely and ethically, because otherwise we're going to fall behind. But another really interesting part of the world is the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And as the oil economies of Saudi Arabia and UAE seek to diversify away from oil and energy, one of the things that they're doing is trying to become very high-tech economies, right? And artificial intelligence is absolutely leading the way with these strategies. And there's so much money going to be invested in the Gulf in the coming decade when it comes to artificial intelligence. Again, even though these are relatively small countries, they are perhaps going to punch above their weight when it comes to power that is harnessed by artificial intelligence. And that means in a military sense, in an economic sense, and ultimately, a geopolitical sense.
And societal as well, presumably,
Absolutely.
Because a lot of the things that we're talking about are going to have a direct impact, aren't they, on people, whether or not it's because they are using the technology, being displaced by the technology, seeing more opportunity via the technology, or just being completely divorced from the technology, I guess.
I think it's very difficult to be divorced from the technology, right? I mean, you can make that choice, but it's extremely difficult, because is it really a choice? If you say you want to be divorced from technology, you can choose to, go off grid, live deep in the Amazon, but how much of a choice is that really for most people? So I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of the population of the world is going to be impacted by these technologies, of which artificial intelligence is just kind of the latest layer. But with regards to everything else, I mean, it's going to fundamentally redraft, the way not only that we live, but the way that we work. And one of the things that is most exciting for kind of a lot of the big tech companies that are now developing the foundational models that are at the cutting edge of artificial intelligence development is how it's going to reshape the enterprise, right? Mm-hmm. Again, if you take it back to now AI has these capabilities, and there's this huge debate about whether or not it's actually intelligent, whether it can actually understand, whether it's actually sentient. So putting that debate aside for a second and just understanding that the way that it can augment knowledge work and the way that it can actually further human knowledge and intelligence means that once it's implemented into workflows and processes, it's going to change the way that we work, and there's going to be huge kind of economic value associated with that as well. So it's not only that it's happening at the level of high geopolitics in the context of national security or economic growth, it's also happening in the enterprise. And then finally, this layer of how this technology is being democratized and becoming accessible to billions of citizens around the world as well. A good kind of comparison is the internet itself.
Want more insight into data integrity and the implications it has for artificial intelligence and information security? Download the Threat Horizon 2024 Executive Summary at securityforum.org. If you're an ISF member, you can access our full report on ISF Live. Threat Horizon 2024, The Disintegration of Trust. Get in touch directly with Steve at steve.durbin@securityforum.org or on LinkedIn and become an ISF member today.
And this sort of an all-pervasive nature of what you're talking about here, I suppose, has to throw up a major security concern around the integrity of the data that is being fed into these systems. Because after all, if we've got this all-pervasive use of artificial intelligence, and either the data is flawed or has been deliberately tampered with, how are we going to know? That's the question, I think, from a security standpoint that people are asking. How can we actually ensure the integrity of the data above and beyond the basic security systems and processes and procedures that we have? Because as we move increasingly into an environment where AI is so much more powerful, I suppose the question from a security standpoint is, are we doing things sufficiently well in order to preserve the integrity, or are we going to have to change the way in which we look at that? And the challenge with that, of course, is that there is already so much data out there that you can't go back in time.
I mean, when it comes to information security and, the implications with regards to AI, they're It's just so vast and always difficult to grasp. But I think your field is one where you constantly have to evolve and be vigilant, and it's an adversarial game by its nature. And absolutely the point you raise with regards to data is going to become extremely important, because one of the things I suspect is going to happen, because again, if you consider these new capabilities of AI to generate or create, that includes any kind of digital information, content, or data. And there are going to be use cases where synthetically created data or content or information is valuable. But one of the things that it's also going to lead to, because of the ability to scale data and content and information, is just an inundation of ever more data. So being able to kind of go through this extremely cacophonous information ecosystem, which is already a challenge now, will be actually made even more difficult with the rise of synthetic data and synthetic information. So with regards to what do we need to do, I think that authentication and provenance needs to become a fundamental part of the actual information ecosystem. So kind of trying to build into, hardwire into the actual architecture of the internet, the right standards and technology so that authentication, zero trust almost becomes the norm rather than the exception. But it's as you know from cybersecurity and information integrity, there's many layers of resilience that are going to have to be developed, and that's just one approach. If you think about other kind of technical solutions, people have suggested that detection can be a way to go forward as well, although the jury is out as to how effective that can be. And I think the harder thing also are the non-technical solutions, education, literacy. How do people get upskilled in terms of understanding the new capabilities of artificial intelligence and how they'll be deployed in their respective domains? So I think it's not only that there are technical solutions, there are also societal and learning solutions, which are perhaps we're going to have to get on top of very, very quickly.
And what's your take on the role of regulation in all of this? Because if you look around the world, you've just pointed out different stages of investment and development in China, United States, and the Middle East, the Gulf in particular. If we look at the way that regulation is moving, we've got something of this patchwork quilt that's evolving. So the EU, who are looking long and hard at their AI Act, Canada, that has already got something that's a variation on that, not following the same exactly. The UK taking a much more liberal stance, perhaps a wait and see. Let's not over-regulate because we want to encourage investment and so on. What is the role of regulation, first of all? And do you actually think that regulators know what they're doing?
So, first of all, there has to be regulation. Just how many industries are regulated, it should be no different for artificial intelligence, especially when the potential risks of AI deployed maliciously the stakes are so high, right? But with regards to where the regulation stands now, you're right to point out that the EU is kind of the first in terms of their framework that they're developing with the EU's AI Act. But it's difficult because the technology is truly exponential, right? And you can see that even with the EU's AI Act, which, the drafting process started years ago, but made no mention of generative AI until some of the developments over the past year. And they've very busily been redrafting and kind of trying to identify AI systems using a risk-based approach. And now the suggested legislation and the wording actually makes reference to foundational models, which it didn't do before. But it's tricky, right? Because the technology is evolving so quickly that the regulators are always going to be behind. And this has always been, it's ever been thus.
Yeah, it has.
But now that's been amplified by the nature of how quickly this technology is being developed. And a really interesting thing about artificial intelligence is that the breakthroughs over the last 10 years, actually, if you look at AI investment over the past decade, it hasn't been that high. It was about $120 billion worldwide in 2021. Now, with even that limited worldwide investment, we've seen such breakthroughs, the investment is going to step up. That means the applications, the democratization, the integration into the internet and online ecosystem, as well as workflows, is going to be accelerating at such a pace that it's going to be difficult for regulators to understand, keep up, and also figure out how to balance regulation in a way where you're not stifling investment and innovation, because it's a dual-use technology, right? We know that there are going to be many incredible effects associated with artificial intelligence. So how do you get that balance right? And I think a key part to that is regulators have to work with the industry. There's no way they can do this themselves. And already in many of the kind of more promising areas with dealing with some of the challenges, such as information integrity, when you come to questions like provenance, you see industry championing the way and supporting regulators. So if you think about, for instance, the C2PA, which is a body which is building the first kind of open standard for authentication and provenance and content that is led by industry leaders like Microsoft, Intel, ARM, and now has been adopted as an approach that's been recommended by the US government and by the EU as well.
Yeah.
So it's a challenging time for regulators. Nonetheless, regulation is needed, and regulators have to work with the people who are actually building the technology.
I think that's a very good point, isn't it? Because, given the speed of change, given the way in which big tech is so actively involved in the developments that are ongoing, it is, as you point out, an impossible task for the regulator to keep pace with that if they're going to try and do it on their own. Yeah. And I think particularly about potentially some of the bigger changes that would need to come about if we consider certain vertical sectors. So for me, one of the biggest and most exciting areas as far as AI is concerned is the way that might be used in the whole investigative research into disease and so on. But if we just look at the US for a moment, you've then got HIPAA that sits on top of that. You've also got some of the guidelines that have been produced for the way in which medical research can be conducted. Getting those sorts of things changed or flexed, that's a major issue and challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that now it's becoming apparent that because of the pervasive nature of AI, when you actually talk about regulation or the applications across certain verticals, regulation already exists, like in medical research. So the coin goes the other way as well with regards to, okay, well, how can we actually harness some of the potential upside of what this means for medical research whilst already existing in this regulatory framework. So again, the challenge is vast. And this is why you can't think about, AI as a single vertical, because it's vertical and horizontal and all pervasive, but you need to break it down, industry by industry, which is kind of the approach that the UK is taking, right?
Yeah, it is. It is. So Nina, let's try to sort of, do a bit of forecasting, forward looking. Roll things forward 5 years. Where will we be from an AI perspective?
So I think that the capabilities that we see now are going to be significantly advanced. I think that the level of investment, the taps are only really kind of turning on now, thanks to what's been happening over the past few years. And that is going to manifest in many, many applications, consumer applications, business applications. I think there'll be an associated kind of boost to the economy. One study suggested that just across 63 different productivity use cases, generative AI could generate up to $4.4 trillion of value annually, which is more than the UK's GDP. And I think that certain companies who have been leading are going to become extremely, extremely wealthy. So I don't think that the question is, will there be economic value associated with AI? I think absolutely, but the question is, how's that going to be distributed and is it going to be monopolized? So that's going to happen with regards to the tech giants, who I think will become very, very, very powerful. I think this will continue to be a priority of utmost importance to governments. I think this challenge or this kind of race between China and the US with regards to artificial intelligence will continue to play out. I think the Middle East is going to become a strong contender. I suspect Europe might fall behind a little bit.
Right.
And actually, I think that this technology is also going to be in the hands of millions of people, because the innovation right now is still, well, it's happening in a few places, but there's this flourishing open source community as well. And I think that means that there's going to be many, many consumer applications. That means that the capabilities are going to be harnessed in a way that just is faster than any technology we've known before.
Fascinating talking to you, Nina. We should get back together again in 5 years' time and see how it's changed, but perhaps we won't wait quite that long. But thank you very much indeed for coming along, sharing some of those insights. I'm sure that the listeners found that certainly food for thought, and hopefully some will listen and indeed learn from some of the things you've been talking to us about. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
If you found value in the conversation today between Nina Schick and Steve Durbin, please rate and review the podcast and share this episode. Check out all our media and resources. All of it is there to support you at securityforum.org. Don't miss the ISF Analyst Insight podcast, sharing conversations with members about the real-world applications of ISF research. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox Productions and Tavia Gilbert. Thanks for listening.